Right, rook endgames where all the pawns are on one side of the board and one of the two sides has a pawn majority on that side of the board. So for example, in this position, white has a 4-on-3 pawn majority. I've already covered it in rook and 2 pawns versus rook and 1 pawn, the pawns being on the same wing. So I'd recommend you have a watch of that video before carrying on with this one. A, because it's a subset of this, and so it'd be useful to be familiar with all the ideas. And B, because we could see this position transposing into it. I mean, the first thing to say is that the drawing chances are usually pretty high for the defending side. This particular position is just completely drawn. This is sort of black to play. This is a game from 1951 between Petrosian and Keres. So yeah, this position is just completely drawn. But how would white go about trying to win it? Because I mean, if you were white, you'd still carry on and try to win this. Well, you've got to create a passed pawn. Okay, how are you going to create a passed pawn? Well, this e-pawn. Push it forward to e6. Problem, black can just take that. So you're going to need to be able to take it back. That means you're going to need a pawn on f5. Problem, you're going to need to be able to take it back. So you'll need a pawn on g4. Okay. Now once white's achieved that plan, with that colour code that I've just sort of beamed through, white's going to have a passed pawn on the e-file, and there's still going to be h-pawns left on the board. And there might be winning chances in that setup. I mean, there's still probably quite high drawing chances thinking about it as well, but you know, there may be winning chances stemming from the fact that it's not just rook and a pawn versus rook, with the black king on e7 or e8. So black's thinking, wouldn't it be nice if I could take on g4 and force white to take back? And then we're going to go 4-on-3, 3-on-2, 2-on-1, 1-on-0, with our king on e7 or e8 at the end of it. It's just going to be a cast iron draw. And that's why at the top level, whenever you get positions like this, you will immediately see the defending side play a move like h5 and this wave setup. As it happens, just out of interest, the engine just thinks, I don't even need to worry about that, I can just play rook a8. If I had this position as white, I would now say, well, all right, I'll play g4 then, I'll get on with that plan. The engine just doesn't care, just out of interest. I mean, I wouldn't do this as black, I wouldn't recommend it, but, you know, good luck beating an engine from there. Although, interestingly, it said 0.0 at the beginning on its rook a8 move, and it's now... Well, it changed its mind to 0.4. It's now changed its mind back again to plus 0.1. But you know, you'd carry that on. You've maybe given yourself half a chance by the fact that black hasn't forced that swap. So we'll still have h pawns hopefully left on the board at least by the time we come to create that passed pawn. So we'll go through this game in a bit. I mean, it's just a draw, and it does end up being a draw. Once black's played this h5 move, so Keres played h5, and Petrosian there was lots of shuffling about, but eventually played this plan, okay, h4, f3, and g4. It didn't get him anywhere, but you know, let's see what happens when white tries that as a plan. Okay, so we're going to see that this is just drawn, and then we're going to look at some other positions. Okay. There's no point carrying on discussing positions where it's just a draw. They're not particularly interesting, but it does give you a sort of starting point of like, right, well, that's just a draw, but what if black can't get their pawn to h5? So this is a game from 1956 where Botvinnik is white, and you can see that black didn't get their pawn to h5 in time. So white is going to be able to create a passed pawn with other pawns still left on the board. This is actually just winning for white. And we'll look at that. 4-on-3 can become 3-on-2. We'll look at this position from 1931 where Capablanca is playing white, famous for being brilliant at endgames, although criticised quite heavily in the way that he played this one. I'm probably not going to do justice to all the different variations that are in the Dvoretsky endgame manual on this. I'm just going to sort of do my best on it, but yeah, there's a lot of variations when we go through that game. Then we've got this one from 1954 where black hasn't played h5 yet. So it's white to play in this position. What should white play given that black hasn't played h5 yet? There are a couple of games where, I mean, this one where black's got a pawn majority and white's not only managed to play h4, but they've played h5, so it's white coming down the board even though black's got a pawn majority. And this position's also drawn, but we'll see how white messed it up and managed to lose the game. And similarly this one. This is a 3-on-2. And it's also a draw, but we'll see how white managed to lose the game. So yeah, I mean, I've already said that there's an ideas thing going on. It's not so much learning the procedure in each given pawn configuration. It's sort of gleaning as many ideas as possible. Some of the ideas are positional, some of the ideas are tactical, and in those two positions you'll see some, I'd call it a tactic, really, that the white side messed up with a similar tactic in both. And the final position we'll look at, this is one where the defending side has managed to play h5, but at the same time white's got this e5 pawn push in. This is still completely drawn, but this is a game from 2000 where Kasparov was black and managed the player with the white pieces managed to win it. Just showing you that although there are drawing tendencies, he beat sort of one of the best chess players of all time. Probably was the best chess player of all time at the time, back in 2000. I'm not saying he isn't now. It's probably still a contender for that, I would have thought. But yeah, he managed to lose this position. So it's obviously drawing tendencies, but not just cast iron draw. So this is an interesting position. It made me think, actually, by the way, just in case anyone cares, that given that the player with the white pieces managed to beat Kasparov from here, that maybe in this position we should try and engineer that pawn configuration. I've tried to do it against Stockfish. It doesn't let me do it. It does all sorts of attacking with the rook and stops me from achieving that pawn configuration. Not that it's won, that position we just saw. That is still a draw, but Kasparov managed to not draw it, showing that maybe it's not as easy as you'd think. But yeah, just out of interest, I tried to do that against Stockfish and it wouldn't let me. Right, let's get on with it then. So I mean, I've said that black's played this h5 move because they want to just swap as many pawns as possible, and just to recap, that's to make sure that when white creates that pass pawn, they've had to exchange all their pawns to do it, and we're going to, as long as the black king's on e7 or e8, we're going to have a very easy draw for black. So there's lots of messing about in this game. I won't spend any time at all on all the messing about because there's nothing particularly difficult about any of these moves. There's not really much that black can do to stop white eventually getting this sort of thing. Black can't stop that. Okay. But then black can just sort of leave their rook behind the pawns, and that's what Dvoretsky talks about. I mean, it was Keres playing black in this game, and how he just gets his rook behind, and just makes the draw so much easier for himself with his rook behind there. As soon as white's advanced a bit, get your rook in behind. We saw that actually in the rook and 2 versus the rook and 1. I think it was a Smyslov game, and if there was enough space behind, the defending side should just get their rook behind, and it's just drawn basically. And that applies, I guess, for 4 and 3. So yeah, lots of messing about, and the messing about carries on. Something I found interesting, if I can find it, is I kept finding as I was going through the moves that there were lots of transpositions into existing games, not just similar positions, but exactly the same position. So this position occurred obviously in this 1951 game between Petrosian and Keres, but in the database I've also got a 1996 game and a 2008 game, where the moves that white played were rook b2 and e5 check. Okay, whereas Petrosian played rook e3. So at least 3 Masters level games have reached this exact position, indicating it's sort of a very common setup. I investigated which openings all these games, because these games, they kept popping in to, you know, that this position occurred in here and here and here and here. And I was interested in which openings they came from, just to sort of gauge, am I going to be getting these positions? Because I've only really had this once in a competitive game of this. I think I've probably played about 300 games since I started playing chess again. And they come from the places you'd expect, mostly. Queen's Gambit declined, semi-Slav, English. But also, there were a couple of Roy Lopez openings and an open Sicilian opening as well that, you know, eventually led to this position. Or, you know, similar to this position with this 4-on-3 thing going on. Anyway, yeah, let's keep going to the interesting bits, although not massively interesting. So yeah, we've just that E5 move. We've just transposed into a game, for example, from 2005, where Judith Polgar was black, and that game started off as an open Sicilian. So it doesn't have to be a D4 D5 setup. Black plays King F8 in this Petrosian Keres game, and we're at the place where Petrosian's going to sort of carry on with the plan of G4, and we'll see that plan does nothing. But, you know, we're at the point of the position where there's something worth discussing. There was nothing black could do to stop white shuffling around and eventually engineering this pawn push. Okay. Just out of interest, what white could try here is something like King G5, just sacking the G3 pawn with the aim of sort of getting at the black king. So in Rook endgames, quite often it's not just the number of pawns you've got, it's the number of quality pawns or the number of dangerous pawns you've got. And, you know, if you can use pawn sacrifices to get your king into a better place, maybe some umbrella ideas might creep in occasionally, mating themes, then all of a sudden you could transpose into a winning version of rook and pawn versus rook or something like that. So this attempt here, it doesn't really do anything. So I'm going to try and get at the black king, e6, king takes g6, checkmate threatened, but black just pops back to g3 with a check, and this position's just completely drawn. I've got a feeling that even if black didn't have this e-pawn, it would still be drawn. It's the dreaded f and h pawns, which I'm yet to really investigate, or rather I have investigated and found it sort of above my pay grade for now, really hard. But if that's a draw, then this one is too. I mean, the other thing is after this king g5 sacking the g3 pawn, black doesn't have to take it. Black can just say, all right, I'm going king g7. You know, I don't want to take your g pawn. And what we'd probably see there is g4 and it transposes into the game anyway. So g4 played, takes, king g7, king comes into g5, and just look how good black's rook is on this half-open f-file. Rook e4, black just keeps their rook on the f-file. If white offered a draw here, realising they're not going to get anywhere, I would say play or move. And if they didn't play e6, allowing this checkmate in 1. Okay. Don't know if you'd call that a tactic. Would you call that a tactic? I'd just call it a blunder, probably. But tactics are always there. The potential for blunders is always there in rook endings. And by the way, if you're going to sort of manoeuvre your king in front of your pawns in this way, you absolutely should be cautious of checkmate themes like that. But Petrosian didn't fall for a checkmate in 1. He instead tried a cheeky trick of his own. So h5, g takes h5, g takes h5. Black then plays f6 check, sort of forcing the issue. That's a very good move. It looks at first like, well, hang on a minute, I can just take that, and now you sort of stupidly left your rook hanging, and I can deflect your king off the defence of it. You know, I can check. That forces rook f7, and now how about this? h6 check. And you can't move your king off the defence of that rook. And then my h-pawn's coming through. You know, you just get king g8, and we'll take the h-pawn with the rook if necessary. So it does hang together, this f6 check. So white played king g4. The f5 check fork doesn't work. That's a completely won king and pawn ending. Okay, remember, if the floating square of those pawns reaches the back rank, those pawns would actually promote without the help of their king, although they have the help of their king, so that's completely won. So obviously Keres didn't play f5 check, but instead left the threat of f5 check on the board. And how about this for a sneaky little last roll of the dice? h6 check. That pawn cannot be taken because white just pushes the e-pawn. Like, what are you doing, you madman? You've just lost your rook. Yeah, but I'm going to get a queen. Didn't happen in the game. Keres wasn't falling for that. Black's actually only got 2 drawing moves here. One of which I'd say is the obvious move. Once you've worked out you can't take the h-pawn, and one of them less obvious. I mean, you can see you don't want to play king f7 because e6 check is coming in, but king g6 is absolutely fine, and they agree to draw there. So yeah, I mean, if you get a position like this, just set up that wave and just sort of do nothing, and if as white comes forward, bring your rook around the back, and there's not really anything that white can do. Just watch out for some sneaky little tricks at the end, I suppose. So next, this is a game from 1956 where black hasn't managed to get h5 in, and white's come up the board and is in a pretty strong position. We're going to create a pass pawn, and there's a bit of do not hurry going on in this position. So yeah, Botvinnik was white. The first thing he did was play rook to a5, and again, interestingly, we've transposed into a game that happened in 2023, and we're still in it after rook c7, and Botvinnik played rook d5 in that particular game. Someone played e5, fine, but with these positions you keep transposing in and out of other games that have had exactly the same position. So yeah, black did nothing. Botvinnik brought the black was Najdorf, by the way. So yeah, white brought the rook to d5. Black just carried on doing nothing. Again, we've transposed into a different game. This one, 1999. The player with the white pieces played rook d4. Botvinnik pushes the e-pawn. There you go. There's your passed pawn. And this is one for white. We've got a passed e-pawn, and we've got g and h pawns still left on the board. Okay. King e7, good place to have the king, blockading the passed pawn. And then Botvinnik pushes the e-pawn, which is now threatening rook d7. Always be ready to transpose into king and pawn endings. And that's obviously a winning king and pawn ending after deflecting the black king off to d7. You come in and play Pac-Man over here. So yeah, rook d7 check, swapping the rooks, is threatened. And Najdorf played rook a4. If rook a6, this is pretty simple for white. Rook d7 check, king f8, king into g6, rook takes e6. Another transposition into something easily winning. Okay, you can see that both the black g pawn and h pawn are falling. That's going to be a very easy win for white. So yeah, rook a4 played in the game, and now white plays g5. Rook d7 checks, not throwing away the win, but it's not as good here. Rook d7 check, king f8, rook f7 check, king g8, and now g5 would throw away the win, because black can just play rook a5 check. Sure, if black takes the g pawn, then yeah, white's won. Black's had it. But black's got this rook a5 check, and it's like, oh no. Okay, our g pawn's falling with check if we're not careful. Like king g6, you've just walked into a checkmate there, so you just got to be a bit careful again. King e4, and you think, well, what's the problem here? You know, black, as soon as black takes this g pawn, we'll just drop our rook back on the f file, and this is just going to be too dangerous. But black doesn't take the g pawn. Black can just play rook a6. So, oh, yeah, oh. So you've got to be a bit careful. Although, as it happens, even after this, in this Rook d7 check line, you don't have to push the g pawn here, like Rook b7 still. Just completely winning for white. A bit of retracing your steps going on there. So g5 played, and Rook a7 was played in the game. I mean, if that g pawn is taken, Rook d7 check, King f8, Rook f7 check, King g8. We're going to see a line similar to the lost position in one of those lines from a second ago. I mean, black might think to push the g pawn. It's really not looking good. Okay, push the h pawn. That was to take away black's control of f6. So now we can block Rook a6 check with Rook f6. E pawn's coming through. Rook a8 and then Rook back to f6. And the plan here, the unstoppable plan is that Rook d6 to d8. And that's just curtains. It's checkmate in 4, incredibly, because I guess the black king is just in such a dreadful place that that's checkmate in 4. Anyway, so not h takes g5. In the game, black played Rook a7. And now white has only one winning move. So you could pause the video and try and work out what is that one winning move. White to play and win. So, I mean, the problem you've got is, remember that the black rook came away from the 7th rank because Rook d7 check was just going to transpose into a winning king and pawn ending. But now it's not a winning king and pawn ending because you've advanced your g pawn to g5. And black can simply take. And that's a pawn race that will lead to a draw. So not Rook d7 check. You might think to swap the h-pawns, and I guess the plan would then be to defend your e-pawn for long enough that you can come and win black's h-pawn. And if black ever swaps the e-pawns, you can quickly get your king back to g7. So this kind of idea. Rook off to the side, defend the e-pawn, check, fine. Rook comes to e5. That pawn on e6 can't be swapped after king takes h6, but black just plays king f6. And white's got nothing. If white waits, black can also wait. Rook f5. So that would also be just a draw. So the only one winning move is to stick your rook behind the pawn. Okay, so this rook's supporting that pawn push to promotion. I mean, there's probably even lines where if the king came into d6, I mean, I haven't looked at it straight away, you can push the e-pawn. Again, not that one, because I think the swapping, it depends on where the kings are, but that's always a thing, isn't it, once your rook's behind the passed pawn. In the game, this pawn was taken, but oh yeah, we are discussing this one straight away. King d6, and we're not going to push the e-pawn, we're still defending our e5 rook. Then we can swap the h-pawns and come into f6. So checkmate in 27, don't you know. So h takes g5, that pawn was retaken. That pawn doesn't even have to be retaken. White's position's so good now. King g6, king d6, rook back, g-pawn gets pushed, h-pawn gets pushed as well. That clears the f6 square for the king, and that's just gone. But the pawn was retaken. King takes g5, rook a1, king g6. If rook g1 check, that check can be blocked. So instead, rook f1 was played. So after king takes g7, that check can't be blocked. Botvinnik brought the king to h6. We saw rook g2, rook g5. And there, black had enough. Black resigned. So, you know, we've seen in that first position, this h5 move, so important, because otherwise you might end up in a position like this, and we just saw how that was converted with the creation of this passed pawn whilst there's still other pawns left on the board. And all right, there were lots of different variations there where, like, oh, white can mess up the win here and blah blah blah, and I'm sure I didn't explain all of them perfectly, but you know, I mean, hopefully I went through them all. And you can see that the potential is there to win. I mean, this is a winning position, this here. Next, so this is a game from 1931. Capablanca is white, renowned for being brilliant at endgames, aside from being a brilliant chess player anyway. And we've got a 3-on-2. It's very, very good for white, this position. Something that black hasn't managed to do earlier, obviously they haven't managed to get the h5 in, if this came from like a 4-on-3 or whatever. But something else is that this e5 pawn push was actually really very good for white. We'll see a position in a sec that sort of gets round to possibilities to to transpose into this. And at any given time, we're going to see a white pawn on e4 in this other position we look at, and the black pawn on f7. Both sides just continually fail to appreciate that that's the pawn push they wanted to do. Black wanted to play f6 to stop e5, white wanted to play e5. And yeah, so a spoiler alert for the next position. But it means that this position here is completely winning for white. But what's the winning plan? So you could, I mean, your king's cut off at the moment. So what are you going to do about that? So pause the video and decide what's your winning plan. So the winning plan, hopefully, that you came up with is you need to get your rook to the 8th rank and push the f pawn. Because then obviously if king g6, rook g8, well, it's almost checkmate, but you're going to be picking off the black f7 pawn. So yeah, maneuver the rook to the 8th rank and then push the f pawn. If black tries to hinder this plan by hitting your e pawn, you defend your e pawn from e8. The other reason it's good to move your rook to the 8th rank onto the d file is that it can come back and block checks from the side if your king has sort of, you know, if black starts hassling your king with checks from the side, you can come into e4 and shelter from those checks. This rook d4 can come back and block it. So this game goes into the tragicomedies of Dvoretsky's endgame manual. There's lots of criticism for it because Capablanca apparently did carry out that plan, but sort of only by accident eventually. So yeah, rook b6 played in the game, and apparently this is a big mistake because now black can start just hassling white from the side. If white decides to hide on h4 with their king, black just carries on hassling from the side. And by the way, there's lots of moves here where black could sort of give up on the plan and come, you know, just retrace their steps and go back to what they should have done. But if white carries on with this plan, insistent, on hiding the king on h4, we'll end up in this drawn position here. So not king g3, but king f3. And black just carries on hassling. King e4, rook a4 check. That's where rook d4 would have been useful. King comes into f5. It's hiding, but it's in the way of its own pawn. Remember, the plan is to get the rook to the 8th rank and push the f pawn. How are you going to do that if your king's in the way? I mean, your king has no squares. The white king has no squares right there. So black just sort of does nothing and says, well, you have no squares. So white comes to the 7th rank, threatening e6. That's quite a nasty threat. How's black going to deal with it? If rook c5, pinning the pawn, then you've let white out, basically. Then white can revert to getting their king back and starting again, but with their rook on the d file. Okay, so not rook c5. This game's been analysed to death in various endgame books. This is the bit where there's just too many variations. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to do them all justice. But king f8 got analysed to death, and white's got this nice little way to win it from here. e6 takes, and then just king e5. Just wait, and you're trying to entice rook c5 check here. If black says, well, I'm not playing it, I'm just going to wait around. If they wait around with their rook, you come and pick off the h-pawn. If they wait around with their king, you come and pick off the e-pawn. So black can't wait around, and you have enticed rook c5 check. But with the black king on f8, you come into f6, and now black's got to deal with that probably with something pretty passive, like rook c8. In fact, that's the engine's top move, rook c8. So that's just good for white. So not king f8, but king g8. Because now, if white tries this e6 move, then you can take it, and now you can play rook c5 check, because this king f6 doesn't carry a checkmate threat. So black just attacks your f pawn. Or if you take the e pawn, your king's out in the open, and that's a drawn version of rook and 2 versus rook and 1. So what does white do against this this king g8? You might be tempted to push the g pawn. You can see it takes rook c5, also just drawn, fairly comfortably drawn for black, that position. White's best move is rook b3, and the plan is here we're going to come and get our king out. It's almost a bit of sort of a change of plan. King g7, rook e3. I mean, black can't stop you on your rook e4 idea. So rook back to c6, then the king's out, rook c4 check, king f3, rook back to c6. Black's just sort of doing nothing here. And yeah, the do not hurry principle in the endgame. If we push the f pawn, it's already a little bit overextended. King f8, rook a3, rook c1, rook a8 check, king e7, f6 check. So it looks like we're getting the plan in at last. You know, we've got the rook to the 8th rank and we're pushing the f pawn. But the black king's in a pretty good place here. And after e6, rook c6. How about that for a really clever drawing idea? Obviously we can't do this because we lose both our f pawns after that. After rook takes f6 comes with check. I mean, I'm sure there's like a myriad of other variations, things that in the middle of that line that you're thinking, oh, why couldn't have white played this or black played this and the rest of it. That was just one example line given if the f pawn gets pushed straight away. So white just needs to carry on being patient. Rook a3. We might see f6. Rook a7 check. King back to f8 takes. Rook takes f6. King g3. King g8, rook a4, and we're just going to guard that pawn and come in with our king. And this position's actually, white's doing very well in this position. The sort of the king over here and then off to h4 idea could have been played back in this position as well. So yeah, this idea. Anyway, I mean that was quite a lot of different variations stemming from the king g8, but yeah, rook b3 is what white should play, and their aim is to get their king out again. Woo, turn it into a knight and bring it round over here. Right, everyone clear on that? So rook b6 played, slight mistake, should have brought it to the d file to get ready as a blocker, but thankfully black played rook e3. So what should white do here? Well, rook b4 was played in the game, which apparently is not very good at all. What white wants to be doing is getting on with their winning plan. The problem is with this winning plan here is that the black rook's on the e-file, and the black rook is a nuisance on the e-file. It's got all this space on the e-file. So rook b8 would see rook e4, king f3, rook e1, rook to e8. Black can play this h5 move in this position. Okay. The hassling the rook is just going to be a pendulum, hassling black's rook. If we push the g pawn, then check and push the h pawn. And if instead we take the h pawn, check, keep checking, and then rook h1. It was a nice way for black to achieve a draw there, and that all stemmed from the black rook being on the e file after rook b8. So what white should actually play in this position, apparently, is rook to b1, just to take the first rank off the rook so we can shift it off the e-file in a sec. If the black rook tries to stay on the e-file, then we can come in and hassle it off the e-file and then play rook b8. Rook a3 check, king g2. Then if it comes to the e-file, rook e8, check, king f3, rook e1. Then we can play f5. We might see check. This is just one of the variations given. King e2, rook f4, king e3, rook takes g4, f6 check, king h7, e6, and yeah, white's won. So anyway, that's what white should have played there. They should have played rook b1. Capablanca played rook b4. Black played rook c3. And again, white should now be playing rook b8, should be getting on with that plan of rook to the 8th rank and pushing the f-pawn. But instead, king f2 was played. Now here, black should be playing h5. We've already seen that as a very nice way to swap pawns and achieve a draw a minute ago. If that pawn is taken, the rook comes and collects. And if that exchange is avoided, the black h pawn is going to be a thorn enough in white's side to at least sort of swap for one of these 3 pawns over here. Well, in that pawn configuration it would have to be the f pawn, wouldn't it? It got swapped for. But h5 was not played. Instead, rook a3 was played. Rook b7, king back to g8, rook b8 check, king g7, f5, and white went on to win. So eventually this winning plan of, you know, the rook controlling this back rank and pushing the f-pawn, it was found. I think black actually resigned there. So yeah, that could have gone into, I think Dvoretsky didn't put it in tragicomedies, but said could have put it into the tragicomedy section. Right, next, this is a game from 1954. It is white to play. It should be fairly obvious from the discussion earlier that if it was black to play, black should be playing h5. Okay. Just, you know, they've set up the wave pawn formation, and what they're doing there is they're just setting up a series of swaps so that, well, in fact, with the white pawn on h4, it's very difficult to see how white's going to be able to create a pass pawn at all there once the black pawn's on h5. So obviously white's going to play a move that's geared towards the fact that black hasn't played h5 yet. You might think to play g4 to stop h5, but you'd get a nasty shock. It doesn't stop h5. You either push the g pawn, and then those pawns are just going to become locked, or you create 2 pretty useless doubled h pawns, and just no pawn's going to get pass pawn. Sorry, is going to get created there. So not that. In the game, Victor Korchnoi played h5 exclamation mark. Okay, just trying to get that space that we saw in that position. That was the Botvinnik-Najdorf game from 1956. Yeah, kind of, maybe not that game so much, but yeah. h5 played. Black plays rook a5. Now that's a really good move. The reason that's a really good move becomes clear later, but it forces g4. White doesn't really want to play g4, which are sort of, like I say, becomes clear later. Rook c8 check, king h7, g4, g5 takes, king takes, and we're not too far off here, by the way. This pawn configuration, this was the Capablanca game. Okay, that's how that position started. This is where we've got to in the Korchnoi game from 1954. So pretty similar. I remember I said that in this game, in the Capablanca game, that white pawn having already got to e5, it was one of the main reasons black had problems. It would have been nice for black if they'd been able to play f6 earlier. And that's a thing here. If white plays f4 here, black wants to play f6. And yeah, there's just no way for white to make progress in that position. It's a pretty good place to have the pawn. So yeah, rook a5, that was the variation where white tried to refuse playing g4 but ended up playing it anyway. G4 played. Okay. Now rook a7 played, but in fact black should be playing the important, this stupid scrolling thing on my chess doesn't let me get to the right move. Black wants to be playing this f6 move. It's just a really useful pawn push in this position. Okay, get it in before white plays rook c8 check, so then your king can slot into f7 as well. Rook c7 check, king back to g8. Okay, if white pushes the f pawn, then the white king's going to get cut off. Also similar to the Capablanca game, but we've now got the pawn on f6. There's a big advantage for black. So don't push the f pawn. Let's try and get the king in first. King f3, check, king f4, hit the pawn, king f5, rook takes f2, looks bad there. Yeah, it is. King g6, white's won. So king h7 to stop that. f4, rook f2. Similar to the first game where Keres was black and brought the rook behind to sort of really, lock white down from behind. And yeah, I mean, what does white do there? The engine just got 0.0 on all 5 of white's best moves. This is, yeah, there's just no way to make progress there, is there? But that's f6. So black doesn't play f6. Black plays rook a7. In the game, rook c6 played. Okay. But in fact, black should be playing rook c8 check. Okay. King h7 and push the e-pawn. This pushing of the e-pawn was such a useful thing to do. It is apparently objectively drawn after rook e7, but very, very hard for black to defend this. So look at some possible variations. g5 takes, king takes g6 and f4, and we have reached the same configuration as the Capablanca game. Remember, the plan was to get the rook to the 8th rank and push the f-pawn. So engine's got +4 on that one. We might see rook a4, king g3, rook behind the e-pawn, defend the e-pawn. Remember, that was always the plan if the e-pawn got hassled. Then we might see g5, h takes g6, king takes g6, and as I lose my thingy, f3 there. So yeah, apparently black's objectively the best move, which apparently is objectively drawn, but there's a world of variations after it, I'm afraid. Rook e7, f4, and then play f6. White would come back and defend the e-pawn, takes, rook f7. So what does white do here? In this position, you could pause the video and have a think about it. How are you going to get your king across the f-file? Is there anything at all here that white could do to try and win this game? So a couple of moves you might think to play. King g3, just bring the king forward, but black can play g6, and the draw's sort of becoming pretty clear, just swapping more pawns, and again we're stopping white crossing the f-file. One move that suggests itself is e6, just push the pawn, that'll force the black rook somewhere. Rook e7, rook c6, and black still plays g6. We play rook d6 to threaten rook d7. Black's only got one drawing move here, so this wasn't a bad try, to be honest. Black's got to play rook e8. Bring the king in, but black swaps pawns and brings their king in. King e4, king f6, king d5, rook e7. No way for white to make progress. So pushing the e-pawn doesn't work either. And there's no way you would think to play this. It's... you sort of really have to understand the flaws of the other variations to even try this, and it's not winning anyway. Is rook d5? I guess you're thinking of this sort of thing. Rook d5, I mean, it's quite a clever move. If g6, e6, the rook has to go back otherwise rook g7 gets played. But then we can check, go e7, rook e8, rook d8. The black king has to come across, and then we could see take, and then this pawn square idea. How cool is that? That's a very nice way to win that one. I like that. So yeah, rook d5, that was g6. If g5, then push the e-pawn, rook f8, push the e-pawn again, and just come behind your e-pawn. And we're going to be winning the black h-pawn and g-pawn for the e-pawn. So rook d5, I mean, Dvoretsky calls it a prophylactic move, but it's still just a draw. Black can just wait with rook f8, king g3, rook f1. Not rook f1, sorry. Black should play g5 there. If black carries on waiting with rook f1, white can now make progress by challenging the rook on the f-file like this. I mean, there's a lot of different variations given there. Like I say, it's hard to sort of do them justice and keep track of all of them. Where did we get to with that, in fact? I mean, that was a long way down the line, wasn't it? That was the rook e7 defense against. Yeah, I remember the point was that e5 was a very strong move. So as a quick recap of that, black has to play rook e7 there, because we looked at rook a4 and g5, both of which led to wins for white. And after this exchange, white should play rook d5 in this position, but black then plays rook f8 and still struggles to draw it. I mean, we've just gone down quite a few different variations that I've sort of lost track of it, if I'm completely honest. So rook a7 played in the game. White played rook c6 when they should have played rook c8 check. Black should still be playing f6, but rook a3 was played. White should still be playing e5, but f3 was played. And yeah, it just sort of carries on like this. Black now played rook a5 when f6 should have been played. So these are the moves that the two sides wanted to have been playing at any given time. It's still drawn at this stage. Rook c8 check, king h7, f4. This is the moves in the game, and we saw a load of checking. The white king runs out to d4, and this is the point where black finally, after all of that, throws away the draw with rook g3. I mean, how hard is this? This is so hard, isn't it, to find out why does rook g3 throw away the game? And well, we're about to see why rook g3 throws away the game, but apparently black should be playing rook f3 here, so that when white defends the pawn, black gets this f6 in, king f5, and we maintain an attack on that f pawn, which is an idea we've already seen. But foolishly, black played rook g3. White played rook f8. Then we saw f6, and then e5. Okay. I mean, in the game, rook takes g4 was played, but briefly, if these pawns are swapped, followed by the g pawn being swapped, rook g1, push the e pawn, check, king into d7, king e8. It's just gone. Again, it doesn't come down to how many pawns you've got, because you can see that black could pick this pawn off very, very easily if they wanted to. It's not how many pawns you've got, it's how many dangerous pawns you've got in rook endgames. Anyway, e5, rook takes g4, played in the game. e6, rook takes f4, check. So black's now 3 pawns against 2, reiterating the number of dangerous pawns sentence that I just said. 3 pawns against 1, e7. This is how the actual game went. Okay, there's your 3 pawns against 0, but It's actually 3 pawns against a rook. And white's plan is this: get your king into the action. Black could desperately try and shoulder you away, but in fact, black did desperately try and shoulder Korchnoi, who was white, away. But eventually the shouldering had to stop. Black couldn't follow the king down the board there because the g pawn would fall straight away. Rook g6. And all of this stuff we've covered in rook versus pawns, how the rook's very effective from, if the king's at the scene, the rook is very effective from the side. Okay. Watch out for stalemate themes though here, got to be very careful. It's still one for white, h2, king g3, king g1, king h3 check. So white just had to watch out for not getting themselves into a stalemate pickle. What's the conclusion out of all of that? I'm sorry, I'll be amazed if I've done every single variation justice and understood the nuance of every single possible line there as I went through them all. But hopefully we've gleaned that black wants to play h5, so white stops it with h5 themselves. And what was the reason? There was a reason that we wanted to force. I never actually came back to that. Let me think. What was the reason we wanted to force that g4 pawn push? Right, I just had to quickly go and recap on why that was so important. Sort of looked it up in the book again. And it was in this line here. Black wants to play this f6 move. Rook c8 checks. This is a line I went through. King f7, rook c7 check, king back to g8. King f3, rook a3 check, king f4, rook a2, king f5, where that f pawn can't be touched because the white king is coming into g6. So instead king h7, f4, and that's here. Rook f2, just tying black down to the defense of the f pawn. Whereas if the white pawn was still on g3, then the white king is free to come into e6, and this passed e pawn is going to get created. That will be similar positions to what we saw actually in the game, where white doesn't mind losing some of their pawns to have this e pawn. As we saw, white lost all their pawns for that e pawn, which then won the black rook. So yeah, I think we've finished with that position. Let's move on. I'm just looking at the length of this video now, but yeah, I'll keep it going because then we've got 3 more positions to go, but 2 of them are very short, and and then one more, that last game involving Kasparov. So this is a game from 1984. It is white to play, and black's got the pawn majority. But not only has white managed to get h4 in to swap pawn swaps, white's actually sort of further up the board with possibly a little bit of a space advantage, to be honest. So in the game, rook b8 check was played, which is fine by itself, but rook b7 was a better move. White should have the plan of just doing nothing. Just do nothing and just wait to see what black's got. And the answer is going to be not a lot. But instead, rook b8 check, king e7, and now just rook b7 check, by the way, is just absolutely fine. Just keep checking the king. But instead decided to go after the g pawn. And now they've lost. Pause the video and work out, what does black do here? So black basically forces the swap of rooks, but the swap of rooks is obviously stupid because that pawn ending is completely lost. So white's now committed to taking on g7, but their rook is trapped. King f8, only 1 square. King g8, only 1 square. King g7, king g5, rook d5 check, resigns. So tactics, always lurking in the position. This is from 1996, white to play. Again, just do nothing. The black king is cut off on the back rank for now. I mean, black would have to try and bring their rook back, and then you could bring your rook to a5 or somewhere. But in the game, white decided to try and force things with f5, and there's nothing wrong with that, by the way, as a move by itself. G takes f5, rook h7. There's nothing wrong with that. King g8, and now again, white should just do nothing. Just keep the black king cut off on the back rank. You can see that black's pawns. I mean, there's two extra ones, but they're hardly great pawns, are they? But stupidly, white took on h5. Black pounced with rook e5, and yeah, I mean the rook's sort of trapped there in the corner. But the main point is that, or on the side I should say, is after king f3, black pushes the f pawn, and I mean, so the rook's trapped. It's not trapped as in you're going to lose the rook, but the only way to not lose the rook is to now swap it into that completely lost king and pawn ending. So careful where you put your rooks in these positions if they start going into the place where there's not a lot of space. Right, last but not least, this is interesting, this one. Like I said, in the original position, the first position I went through in this video, you know, black plays h5 and it's a draw, and we saw Petrosian sort of mess around for ages, eventually get the g pawn pushed to g4, but then black just stuck their rook on the f file, and it was a very easy draw. Watching out for a few sneaky little tricks at the end with that h6 check that's about to appear there. Okay, but it did end up as a draw. And I think I already said earlier on that I quite liked, you know, the fact that this was so obviously drawn. I quite liked in the position we're about to see that white did actually manage to beat Kasparov. So I thought, right, well, if I get this, rather than do the plan that Petrosian has done, you know, I was out on a run and I was thinking, I wonder if I could engineer that position and get the pawn configuration that guy managed to beat Kasparov with. You know, I got back from my run and tried it out, and although it's still drawn, even if I do manage to get that pawn configuration, it's still a drawn position. The engine just didn't let me. It just kept hassling me, and I've forgotten the precise way it happened, but I actually managed to get myself checkmated in one of them, which was obviously pretty stupid. But hey, that's the sort of thing I'm capable of. Right, so yeah, black to play in this position, and black should just do nothing, basically. King g7. The only thing that black might want to think about is what's going to happen, you know, how they're going to stop the white king getting to g5, if indeed they need to. So king h3, rook a7, king h4, black could just play king h6 at this point, just time their king h6 to meet king h4. But they don't even have to do that. They can actually play rook a6. It really doesn't matter if the white rook comes to the 7th rank. Black can just do nothing. Rook e7, just do nothing. King into g5. And rook a5. If the f pawn is pushed, we can see takes e6, but then f4 check. King takes f4 and king f6. And that's still just a drawn position. Or even if rook b6, just keep doing nothing. And white might think to push the e pawn. Check, king back to h4, king f6, rook takes f7, king takes e6. So the sort of doing nothing approach really was quite good for black in this position. But after instead of rook a7, Kasparov brought their rook down to his rook down to d3, and white played king h3. It's still not too late just to carry on doing nothing. Okay, I think we just transposed. But Kasparov played rook to e3, and it's now gone. This position's now a win for white. This idea of putting the rook behind the e-pawn is actually not a bad idea. It does work if the h-pawns are off the board. And that's not anything special about the h-pawns particularly, it's just there are too many pawns on the board for this stick your rook behind the e-pawn and wait plan to work. And now white should pounce. And white should pounce by keeping the black rook on the e-file. Rook c7 forces the black rook to stay on the e-file. I mean, the f-pawn's hanging straight away, king g7. White king comes into h4, and now the black rook has to stay on the e-file because of this e6 pawn push. And I first read that and I thought, well, why do we care about just keep the rook on the e-file? What's the problem? I'll just keep my rook on the e-file. And this is the problem. Rook e7, keep your rook on the e-file, e6. That's what white's going to be doing. This would be a drawn position if these two h-pawns were not on the board. I'll show that in a sec. I deliberately put in some silly moves elsewhere to show that because I was sort of interested in it. So yeah, rook c7. After the rook e3, white should be pouncing with rook c7. In the game, king h4 was played, and black played king g7. But in fact, black can draw with king h6. So if the white rook comes to c7, rook e2, white's got a choice here. I like this line. You think your h-pawn's attacked, move it, pause the video, black to play. What would you do? This is very nice. Most of the stuff we've seen on this video has been positional ideas. Rook endings. There's always tactics afoot. Nice. Free pawn. Can't be taken. g5's checkmate. How about that? King h3. We just go back to g7. Rook b7. g5. F takes g5. King g6. Drawn. Or what if white pushes the g pawn? Rook takes f7. Rook takes h2 check. King takes g2. Rook back to e2. Again, drawn. So yeah, black should have played king h6 in that position. King g7 played and king g5 played back. Again, white should be pouncing with rook c7. Then rook stays in the e-file, king g5, and we've probably transposed. But all the time white's not pouncing and not threatening e6, black's got time to move their rook off the e-file. Because e6 doesn't do anything, obviously, now, because there's no pin. So rook a3, rook c7, rook a5. Okay, and that's a drawn position. But king g5 played instead. So instead of rook a3, black now played, Kasparov played rook e1, just kept his rook on the e-file. I mean, to be honest, if he's failing to get his rook off the e-file in all those earlier moves, he obviously hasn't seen the need to. And we're talking about the guy that had been world champion for God knows how long with astonishing calculation abilities. So this stuff's obviously hard, isn't it? It's obviously very, very hard if he's not seeing that he should be stopping this rook c7 idea. Yeah, so rook c7 and now white's winning. I mean, rook e2 played in the game, and white played rook e7. If rook e4 and rook e7, what was I looking at here? Rook a4. Check this line out. f5, rook g4, checkmate. Okay, so yeah, rook e4 is quite sneaky actually because of this. Yeah, if rook e7, rook a4, and you're just preventing f5. Also, if e6, we've got rook a5 check, king h4, king into f6. and we get back to a drawn position again. So this rook e4 move is quite sneaky, but white should play rook b7. And black's like, all right, what have you got here? This line's really good. White to play and win. Pause the video and have a go at it if you like. And we've seen the problems with things like f5 and the rook g4 checkmate idea. So the fourth rank's a great place for black to have their rook. We've also seen in the e6, then we go rook a5 check, and yeah, that idea. So white should here play g4, takes, f5, takes, and then e6, and it's completely winning. I guess it's like a super umbrella they've given themselves here. So yeah, rook e4 was more interesting than that played in the game, which was rook e2. Now white plays rook e7, and Kasparov played rook a2. I'm just looking at, oh yeah, if rook e4 now, then the e-pawn can get pushed because our rook's supporting it. I'm just going to do some silly moves in a sec just to show how this position, in fact I'm just going to click there and hopefully, yeah, we'll sort of magically get a similar position but with the h-pawns missing. So this is a draw. Takes, takes, g4, king f7, king h6, king f6. White needs this position with black to move. This position with black to move is a win for white. But we're, you know, this is just a draw with black to move. We'll see a pawn race. Draw. Okay. So going back to, where had we got to? Here. This position. Yeah, with the h-pawns on, king f7, then king h6, and when the black king comes into f6, g4, we create that position with black to move, and that's a win for white. Okay. If the king moves back, g5. If a pawn gets pushed, we just take it. I was about to say, I was looking at g5 as an interesting move. We still just take it. Oh, of course we do. Yeah, we go here, and that's that done. So instead of taking the pawn, h4, g5 check, and we're going to see a similar sort of thing to the pawn race we just saw, except there are still h-pawns on the board. Check, swap queens, king g5, win. So this whole winning plan of pushing the e-pawn, it only wins because there's h-pawns still left on the board. Everyone clear? So I've got h4 as one of the possible variations here. Trying to swap the h-pawns for that reason, I suppose. White can play... I've got white can play rook d7, but that throws away the win. White should still just play... oh no, sorry, ignore me. That h4 line was me doing the silly moves to try and recreate that other position. h4 is just a silly move. Yeah, so the rook d7 was just me messing around to get that other position. Anyway, yeah, so Kasparov didn't play rook e4 because he realised there's no point in having the rook on the e file anymore because this e6 is about to win it. Instead, he played rook a2, f5, g takes f5, e6, h4 takes king back to g8, king f6, and there he resigned. So yeah, from that original position, someone managed to beat Kasparov from there because he got a bit confused and this rook behind the e-pawn was the wrong drawing plan, but it took quite a long time to finally pounce with this rook c7 idea. I did particularly like a lot of those. I like the one where you could just take the pawn on e5. I wish I could find that variation again, because of the g5 checkmate. Anyway, that's gone to, that's an hour and 10 minutes now. I'll be sort of amazed if anyone's still watching it or listening to this. I can say what I like now because no one's watching this. So yeah, I doubt I've done every single possible variation justice there, but hopefully lots of different ideas seen. Pawn majority on one side of the board, lots of positional ideas, lots of tactical ideas, and I think we'll call it a day there.